Yo, what up, my dupes? We're back here for the walkthrough crew, Cycle 10, and we're going to cover the stuff that's changed since the last time you saw this. So, obviously, the goal of our research is basically what you should be following along with. We are now on the interior decor step, which means that we have employment, we have meal prep, and we have plumbing right now. So I'm going to go over when those finish, what decisions you should be making at each stage. So, for employment, obviously you want to place the skills board since that's the whole point of it, and you're going to start getting into the skills UI. As you have dupes unlock their skill points, you're going to want to assign them out. Each skill that you assign will have a new morale expectation. When you're picking your skills, you want to make sure you don't exceed the morale you can currently give them, which right now it's probably going to just be 1. So you want to target the ones that have the hearts. And the hearts are the ones that come up on the dupes as their preferred tasks. I don't remember exactly what it's called on that UI, but it'll be things like art, cook. Oh, it's called interests. Yeah, you can see I clearly did my research before starting this video. Yeah, so basically that's all you're going to want to do with employment is just place the skills board. And in general, through this, I'm going to be saying basically a research thing finished, should you place these buildings or not? So starting with employment, you definitely want to place the skills board. The water cooler, you don't. And the reason why is because you're going to start wasting water, and water is a extremely precious resource here in the early game. So pretty much every decision I'm going to be giving you guys from this point forward is going to be about conserving as much water as possible. Because if you run out of water and you have to start panicking and making water, you're going to die. So that's the first in the many line of decisions that's going to be about conserving water. So secondly, our next task on the research is meal prep. So let's look at that research and see what finished there. So meal prep, or excuse me, I sort of skipped a step here. I said to go for meal prep, but it also includes another thing, which is basic farming. So once you get basic farming, you're not going to be necessarily interested in any of these buildings, and in particular, the algae terrarium, do not place that. The reason being is because it makes a lot of polluted water and it wastes a lot of clean water. It's going to be used to remove carbon dioxide primarily, but for now, there's other ways of dealing with it. So I'd say avoid that. The compost, not a big reason to make this right now either, so I would say no real reason to place that. The planter box, same thing. Don't worry about that for right now. As long as you rush into meal prep and you have research going pretty regularly, you don't need these planter boxes, and they're really obnoxious to get rid of and remake later. So I would say skip that if you can afford it. And finally, your ration box. The ration box, you should be like, wait, we already had one of those. And yes, we did. It used to be right here, and I moved it for a very good reason, and that is because your dupes are going to start getting sick now. Your dupes will get sick from being exposed to food poisoning germs, which they're going to get from the outhouses, but also they're going to get on their food. So if you look at the food, it all has these germs in here, and it will continue to grow until you deal with it. So the way that I deal with it, at least in the early game, to at least help, your dupes are going to get sick at this stage, but you can at least help a little bit by building a ration box in a new area. And you want to build it in an area that is, several tiles down. It has a ladder leading to it. And this is so all the carbon dioxide will settle in this area, and it'll start killing these germs on this food. It will help a little bit. Your outhouses are going to be the biggest reason that your dupes start getting sick for a little while. And you're also going to get this warning of no wash basin built. Again, in the interest of conserving water, I'm going to recommend not building any wash basins for right now, and we'll get to those in a little while. Obviously, I think this may be a controversial point. People might disagree and say that sickness is not worth having. Honestly, the sickness doesn't slow them down a ton. If somebody is sick, you can actually see what's going on with them. And it should say exactly what the problem is with the sickness. At least it should. Okay, I guess not. I must have remembered looking this up from somewhere else. So if you need to see exactly what the sickness does, effectively it'll just slow them down a little bit. It's not as big of a deal as it used to be. What used to happen is if they got food poisoning, they would start vomiting all over the place, and that was really bad. Mainly because you just get a big germ infestation. So yeah, sickness, that kind of stuff, it will happen for a little while, so just keep an eye on it. Alright, next. I showed you this a little bit, but I'm shaping up my water area. Reason being is because I have these pools of water, and since we just got our plumbing research done, we're going to start plumbing this water and get it to start growing food for us. So rather than placing something in a temporary spot, I'd recommend just hollowing out an area just to have your water go into. And I would recommend building this kind of lower in your base and then digging up into these little water areas to fill this up. So I'm going to build a couple of ladders here, and note that I am building in a way that the water won't just fall down before I'm ready. So make sure to leave at least a couple tiles here, especially if there are sand tiles, because the sand will just fall and it'll flood everything. So I'm going to start building some ladders here to get this to flow down, and I'm going to dig out some of this stuff so that the water actually does flow into this area. And this is going to be my area basically for my natural water. You can see my third pool of water is this, and again, this is water you want to conserve as much as humanly possible. If you jump back to our research goals, our basically end goal of this section is agriculture, and agriculture is what's needed mostly for your bristle blossoms, which is going to be your food for pretty much the rest of the game. So keep an eye, or rather you're going to be going out for that, and it's basically setting everything up just to get your bristle blossoms planted. So the objective here is that this natural water that you start with is going to, it should ideally be going 100% towards your bristle blossoms and nothing else if you can help it. We'll get into actually cleaning any polluted water and more upgraded buildings later. I don't know exactly when that's going to happen, but it's usually somewhere around, say, like cycle 70-ish is when you're going to start worrying about that kind of stuff. But for right now, treat this as water that's only for food. One of the biggest things that I see killing people is that they run out of this natural water and they have no way to make new water that is cool enough for their bristle blossoms. Well, I'm going to talk about this a lot more in later videos, so don't worry about too much about that now. Just know that you want to collect it somewhere and get it ready to start growing these bristle blossoms. Let's start talking a little bit about food, considering that was another thing that finished in this research. Oh, I should probably go back here and talk about what finished in meal prep. So electric grill's finished. You don't necessarily need this right away. Mess table's finished. You also don't necessarily need this right away. You can, but there's going to be a much better way to do this later on when we have when it's higher in the priorities list. Egg cracker, I would not use this pretty much at all, mainly because you want to keep the population of the critters up around the map. So I've never found a reason to ever use egg crackers, and don't make food quality that's all that great. And again, like I say every time, disclaimer, la 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 la, but people might disagree with this, but I've literally never found a reason to make eggs, so I would just ignore this. But the farm tile is what's interesting. The farm tile is going to be used to grow your mealwood, and you're only going to use this for a short period of time. I'd recommend the farm tile rather than the planter box, just because it's much easier to maintain and it's less to deconstruct when you wind up going to all blossoms. And that's what you're eventually going to use in this agriculture research, is hydroponic farm tile. So in the meantime, just so we can maintain our food, you can see our food's getting a little bit low. I'm going to start planting a bunch of these farm tiles to put mealwood seeds into. So pretty much whenever you discover a new mealwood seed, you want to plant it just to keep a good basin of food here. Another thing to pay attention to is that along the lines in your research, you will eventually get some advanced food prep, which is, where is it? Well, there's a building somewhere that allows you to make, oh, I must already have it researched, that must be why. So there's a building here, this microbe musher. In the microbe mushers, you can make lice loafs, which is basically meal lice, which is what grows on these, plus water. But since we're in such a mode of conserving water, I think you can do without that. And this is, again, a little bit of a controversial point, I think, because this is a very aggressive way of trying to reserve your water. But if you do this right and you do everything correctly and you continue to mine aggressively, especially to find any buried muckroot like this, that will help sustain your food for long enough until you start getting your blossoms up. Another thing that may help, especially since you are obviously watching a walkthrough, you want tips to make the game a little bit easier. Once you get dupes from this, you can ignore the first few cycles of it if you want to. Staying at lower amounts of dupes is okay. There's nothing saying that you have to increase your dupes, because the more dupes you take on, the more they're going to be a tax on your food and your water. The easiest possible way to play this game, which I find a little bit boring, is to basically stay on extremely low counts of dupes, maybe like 6, because then you don't need to plant nearly as much food. Just understand that whenever you take on new dupes, it's going to have a tax of oxygen, it's going to have a tax of food, and it'll start to tax other things like, air, water, whatever. So feel free in these first handful of cycles to ignore the cycles of dupes that come up and just take something else instead. Thus far, I've only ignored one, which is why I have these pufflet eggs here. That's what came up in the selection. So yeah, I would say one of the few times the first few times I played, I wound up dying because I kept taking dupes because I felt like I had to. Definitely feel free to not do that. So let's talk about oxygen management here. So something you might get every once in a while is insufficient oxygen generation. You can add an extra oxygen diffuser if you want. Most of the time you'll get this warning though because you're still running on manual power. So you can mess around with the priorities here if you want to. But the idea is that you want to make sure that your oxygen stays in a reasonable level. And as long as you keep dupes on this every once in a while and you have a couple of oxygen diffusers, and you also set these at a reasonable priority, your oxygen should be fine. One thing that newer players are tempted to do is they're tempted to go down in this tab and be like, ooh, algae terrariums, oh, they suck up CO2, let's do that. But yeah, like I mentioned, don't do that because that will create a huge problem for you later, and that will also waste clean water, which we absolutely want to preserve right now. As far as dealing with the CO2, you're going to probably build up quite a bit, and it depends on your spawning map as well. Some of them have just tons of CO2 pockets around, like this for example, and it tends to build up quite a bit. You can start to mitigate this by just digging out more areas that are lower in your base because the CO2 will tend to fall down to the bottom of your base. So until we actually get something to straight up deal with the CO2, don't worry about it for right now. And one thing I really want to encourage, if you're ever tempted at any point, do not make a pool of water that is just polluted, germy water. That will be the biggest pain in the butt to manage later in the game. Like I mentioned before, you want to maintain the count of critters on the map, so if you are tempted to attack any of these things, especially the hatches, just leave them alone. They don't really do anything for right now, but they will become important later. So if you get the urge to attack any natural critters, leave them alone. The last thing we're probably going to talk about is the polluted dirt that your outhouses are going to start making. This is going to produce a little bit of polluted oxygen. It's not a ton. If you start getting irritated with this, this will have some food poisoning germs in it, so it may contribute to your dupes getting a little bit more sick. Since your dupes are going to get sick here anyway, and since we're trying to preserve as much water as possible, it's probably not that big of a deal, but if you're really bothered by it, you can just make a storage bin down in the bottom of the base somewhere, and just set it to only accept the polluted dirt so that once the dupes empty your outhouses, they just run the polluted dirt down there. You can build these compost things if you really want to. I know I said that you don't have to. It's up to you. I feel like these composts typically will produce way more heat than they're worth and don't really do much. Dirt will be a resource that you need to grow your mealwood, but you should have plenty of natural dirt on the map. So unless the game balance drastically changes, I would say there's no reason to really go out of your way to get rid of the polluted dirt. I would say just store it in the corner if you're getting annoyed with it, and we'll deal with that later. So I'm going to go ahead and play so you guys can watch the water fall down. And again, you're probably going to hit situations where your dupes don't really do things that are very important to you. So if you have a lot of open tasks, feel free to open up this priorities thing and set things to higher priority. Don't have the habit of setting everything to 9 necessarily, but try to prioritize. So for example, I have a big load of digging here and digging here. I'd say this digging is a little bit less important, this one's a little bit more, but the most important is getting my water to fall down here. So you could set these to 7, you could set these to 6, and then these will remain at 5, which is the default. So I just want to get to a point where my dupes will actually dig out some of this stuff and show you how it's going to have the water flow into an area that we want, at which point we can start setting up our plumbing, and then we can start setting up our bristle blossoms, which is going to be roughly somewhere over here. Something general to keep in mind, here we go, lots of stuff flowing into there. And this is much better to do it this way, and especially to pre-build these tiles and ladders and whatnot so that you don't get dupes that are constantly stuck working underwater. This is obviously something I glossed over quite a bit. This is also not necessary. I only do it because it really bothers me not being able to extend my ladders through any water or not being able to dig in certain directions. So you don't have to do that if you don't want to, but I personally like to do it. So we'll do the same thing with this and just try to unite all of our water here at once. Research should continue on, and if your research is going too slowly, you can also increase this just to keep a dupe there all the time. It also depends on what kind of skills your dupes specialize in or like to do. You can see the spread of mine right now. I don't have a lot of great skills, so I have, if the operator is set to do operating stuff, I used my skill there. This person used it on construction, this person used it on cooking, this person used it on digging, and this person used it on art, which goes along with the names for each of these, like we talked about before. So yeah, that's pretty much all of the concerns that I've had from cycle 3 until 10, which is when the last video came out. So this ought to at least put you in a reasonable spot to set you up for success later on. You can continue to shape these things up as time goes on. Just make sure your dupes are prioritizing things that are actually important. One other thing I would recommend is that your dupes can stand on top of these ladders, as you can see them hopping across here. These don't have to necessarily be tiles if you don't want them to. You can use ladders. It will slow down your dupes just a tiny bit, but it's still much better than having the tiles awkwardly, obstruct any water or gas flow. So, yeah, we are stabilizing pretty well. From this point on, we have still not achieved our research goals of agriculture, so you want to shoot for that. By the time the next video comes out, we will have agriculture researched, and we will have our bristle blossoms planted. One final thing I want to say about these bristle blossoms and the food in general is pay attention to the body temperature range for each of these. If you plant your blossoms or your mealwood in a place where they can't grow, that means you have no food, and that means you will quickly die. So make sure that you are planting these out in an area that is not too hot. So for example, if you tried to plant it out here, this is at like 110. There's nothing will ever grow here. You could start to get some stuff from these naturally occurring plants, but still it's much more difficult if you can't control the growth rate of these things. So ideally what you want to do is think about how you're going to be setting up the rest of your base. Alt-S will put you into the screenshot mode, by the way. Ideally, you're going to want to have a section that's relatively cool where all your food's going to grow, let's say right here, and also somewhere kind of central to your base so that the dupes don't have to go very far when they harvest it and then they bring it back to your food boxes, for example. And then if you have anything that's going to be producing a lot of heat, like power later, typically want to put that down at the bottom and specifically away from the food. You want to make sure that this area is pretty much the only thing that needs to remain temperate throughout the game. So choose and plan an area that is not too hot. And you can see I'm digging into areas that are a little bit warm for these, but 85 is the max, and these things can still grow in there. So that's effectively what I'm going to be shooting for now. By the time we come back, you should see an area here that is all my bristle blossoms are already set up. Should see plumbing down here to plumb water into them, and we should be pretty much good to go. So until then, I guess this is my standard greeting now. Okay, bye.